So with Angron and the Lion getting new miniatures, we now have 5 Primarchs returned to the grim darkness of the far future in Warhammer 40k. Let's talk about how these demigods stack up against each other, and which are considered superior by rules, models and lore. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a focused look on the 5 Primarch models of Warhammer 40k, and how these demigods of the Space Marine legions rank up against each other. With not 1 but 2 new Primarchs recently returned to the setting, it does look like Games Workshop really aren't going to be holding back with these. I'm sure we'll see a slow trickle of loyalists and traitors continue to return to make up the ranks, returning from the distant past. In this video, just for a bit of fun, I thought we'd try and rank the Primarchs on 3 different metrics, and to get some actual proper data on it, I asked each of you guys in a few channel polls to rank the Primarchs both in terms of model appearance, strength in game for their points cost, and lore and backstory. For each of these categories, they've got a score between 1 and 5 depending on where they ranked, 5 being the best and 1 being the worst. We'll talk through each of the Primarchs and where they got voted in the 3 categories, maybe have some ideas as to why, and we'll lump the scores together to see how they sit in a Primarch League table if we're rating them by these 3 metrics at the moment. Obviously all 3 of these are at least somewhat subjective, probably the story the most so, then appearance and maybe gameplay being the easiest to determine, but I think it's still pretty interesting to see how the votes stack up. Let's jump in then, we'll take a look at the Avenging Son first, and then go on to his Loyalist and Traitor brothers. So first up we have Roboute himself, Roboute Guilliman of the Ultramarines, and perhaps one of the most notable 40k lore developments throughout Games Workshop's entire recent history, a Loyalist Primarch and the one who wrote the Codex nonetheless, returning to the Imperium and leading a brutal fight back against Chaos with the Indomitus Crusades. Firstly, in the vote for lore and backstory, Guilliman actually ranked the top out of any of the Primarchs, the best of the 5, which to be honest kind of surprised me a bit. I feel like the general reputation of the Ultramarines is being a bit of a protagonist and maybe a little bit Mary Sue-ish within the setting, but I guess Guilliman does actually have a lot more chance for his character to have been developed over the years. He's been a central figure in the 40k plot both in the Heresy and present, and I think in particular the reason that he's been voted this high is that he's got really quite an interesting reaction to the state of the Imperium in current 40k. Somewhat despairing as to how far things have fallen since the days of the Great Crusade and his father sitting on the throne. And I feel like maybe that's been brought to a head recently with the big 10th edition launch cinematic, an eternal perhaps somewhat hopeless war against the Tyranids, with Guilliman narrating and the difference between Imperial propaganda and how badly the war's actually going. Between all that, it seems to have been enough for Mr. Roboute to hoover up about 30% of the vote, putting him ahead of his brother Primarchs in people's favourite lore and backstory for a character. Unfortunately, the same can't be said for his miniature. Out of the returned 40k Primarchs, it seems that he's the least exciting one out of any. Just a bit less standout than some of the others maybe, a bit of a generic leader-hero pose, posing on some tactical rocks. I'm not sure I necessarily would have expected things to be enormously different for him, but it just doesn't really seem to have attracted the same sort of standout attention as some of the other miniatures, all centerpieces in their own right. Finally, in gameplay, you guys rated him 3rd out of 5, which in all honesty I thought was maybe a tiny bit on the harsh side. I might have been tempted to put him 2nd, as we'll get into. Currently, for the Ultramarines at least, he is near enough auto-include in a whole bunch of competitive lists, even though admittedly the Ultramarines in general are being a little bit lackluster on the competitive scene of 40k right now. Guilliman really does add quite a lot to his army for his 300 points though. Obviously he's decent enough in melee and surprisingly hard to kill with his 3+ invul and resurrection mechanic, but for nearby Ultramarines he is a massive force multiplier with some big rerolls plus some extra movement benefits and helping out with some command points adds to that as well. I feel like maybe as a competitive staple for his given army he maybe deserved a little bit better than this, but we'll stick with your guys' vote for the overall scores. Talking of which, as we go along, let's put the Primarchs on the overall scoreboard, see who's coming out on top at least at the moment. Guilliman's our first on the list, entered here with a 9. Moving on, we've got the Avian Primarch of the Thousand Suns, Magnus the Red, the Great Sorcerer. For how strong his lore and backstory is, you guys have rated him 2nd of them, though only very narrowly beating out the contender in 3rd. It's perhaps a bit more tragic and a lot more relatable than a bunch of his brother Primarchs who fell to chaos, dabbling in warp magic and towing the line really quite a bit, then ultimately ruining the Emperor's Webway project with psychic abilities, prompting the Space Wolves to be dispatched to bring him to justice, which got misinterpreted as burn down Prospero. After that happens, there's maybe not all that much choice bar join the Chaos Gods and just really embrace the psychic life. I feel like he's perhaps a bit more of a nuanced character than many of his brothers. Model-wise, he really is a pretty cool centerpiece in his own right, though maybe has again a bit more of a mixed reception than some of his brothers. You guys ranked his model 4 out of 5, though admittedly he does have some pretty stiff competition. Personally, I feel like those awesome wings and the great big staff are really quite strong points of the model. Maybe the head and nipple horns are just a little bit on the weird side. Maybe not the absolute highlights of the model. I suppose Zinch makes your body do some weird things. Gaming wise though, poor Magnus has really been struggling for quite a while. You guys voted him lowest out of any of them here. I probably would agree with that assessment as well. His big issue is that with a wound cap of 18, he can't hide behind obscuring terrain and things, meaning that if you put him on the board, there's a very good chance that he just gets shot straight down off the board. He is a fair bit better if you're playing with some truly massive terrain pieces though, like big tournament L-shaped ruins that can actually hide him. Even though his combat abilities and his psychic powers are really quite powerful, I think he does live up to one of the most potent psychers in the galaxy. It's just not really enough when he costs 420 points, and just maybe isn't enormously tough for that cost, not if the opponent focuses fire for a turn. Putting that together on our for fun scoreboard puts Magnus a fair bit lower than Guilliman, a combined score of 7 points between the lore game and the model. Moving on, we have the bloated and undying leader of the Death Guard. Demon Primarch Mortarion soars aloft on blighted wings, wielding the great scythe Silence. For his lore and story, Mortarion was rated the worst out of any of the current Primarchs returned to 40k. I feel like perhaps his backstory is a little bit less well known than others, particularly having a massive grudge against Psychers, and perhaps one of his major reasons for turning against the Emperor was being denied the vengeance against the Psyker who raised him, a toxin-dwelling necromancer on Barbarous. This was perhaps one of his major reasons for betraying the Emperor during the Horus Heresy, and perhaps just feels a bit more of a minor reason than most maybe. Being denied personal vengeance just seems a little bit petty, given that he wasn't strong enough to take down his old mentor, plus he still wound up dead anyway. It doesn't really change the outcome. In any case, his legion descended to Nurgle, perhaps partly due to being becalmed in a warp storm on the way to the Siege of Terror, being forced into a great pact, and Mortarion wound up becoming a Psyker, one of the things that he despises the most. Things haven't exactly worked out for him. On the flip side though, out of the 5 current Primarch models, despite not being one of the new and exciting releases that have just recently come out, people still rated Mortarion's model as the best objectively out of them. A great Angel of Death soaring into battle wielding his scythe, and all sorts of fun nods and details to his Nurgle heritage. I think the sense of motion is rather good, and his little sensor riding attendants are rather interesting as well. GW have done rather well to realise the Primarch of Nurgle. Finally for gameplay, you guys have voted him second on the list of 5. As mentioned, I might have been tempted to swap him and Guilliman maybe. He is a lot more potent and has an enormous amount of raw might on the tabletop, though I perhaps feel like you pay a fairly appropriate amount of points for that. He is 450 points, so needs to be pretty titanic in terms of what he does, but I feel like for the most part his raw damage and defense does get him there. He is spectacularly tanky, even in the context of 40k 9th edition with all its big damage. Toughness 8, -1 damage, a 4+ invul and a 5+ feel no pain, plus he also often runs around with the gloaming bloat as well, turning off rerolls to enemies nearby. Perhaps means the fact that he can be directly shot is just a little bit less impactful. Unlike Magnus, he does have some pretty good durability for the point, to the extent where it maybe doesn't matter. It's still not maybe quite an auto-include for competitive Death Guard lists, compared with Guilliman for Ultramarines, but I think he remains pretty decently usable. Adding that all up and just putting him on the combined scoreboard for fun, that would rank him at 10 here, just ahead of Roboute Guilliman. Next up, we've got the new cat on the block. Lionel Johnson of the Dark Angels has recently returned to 40k. This guy, being the wild son of the forest who crashed on Caliban, somehow managed to survive into infancy and be taken in by the strongholds of knights holding out against the darkness and the horrors. He led a great purge to redeem the jungles of Caliban, and then was ready to continue his crusade to the stars when the Emperor made planetfall. His lore's kind of intrinsic to the Dark Angels, arriving back to Caliban to find that Luther has led about half the Dark Angels in treachery, both being cast into the warp and the Lion sleeping on the rock for millennia, before, as we know, returning to 40k to lead a company of knights, using some mysterious forest walking magic to walk from world to world and hunting down heretics and monsters. His new version seems to be a bit more of a story of Arthurian legend, and perhaps a bit more of a balanced and less hot-headed character than he might have been during the heresy. In general, his recent model from Games Workshop has gone down very, very well. Hopefully they'll actually get round to putting him on general sale sometime in the near future, as they seem to have a very limited supply of his launch box. When everyone does manage to get their hands on him though, I feel like his miniature is really quite a nicely balanced one, really looking thoroughly menacing and with a choice of different heads, hoods, helmets, or this bear head here. And I feel like in terms of faces for 40k miniatures, they've executed this one far better than many of the others. He looks like a bit of a world-weary old knightly crusader. His watches on the dark add a little bit of interest to the base as well, and I think he still looks suitably ornate enough to be a Primarch, a nice lion heraldry on his right shoulder pad, and bearing the Emperor's shield. Finally, gaming-wise though, the Lion certainly seems to be one of the weaker of the Primarchs. His new stats were ranked 4 out of 5 by you guys, and I must admit I think I'd probably agree with that. He is a bit overcosted to be honest. His melee damage is fairly decent and he's got some okay buffs, but just nothing really all that impressive for a big price tag of 320 points. Particularly his durability is a big letdown. He's likely to maybe kill one thing and then get attacked back in return pretty hard, unless he can manage to hide. Considering he's bearing the shield of the Emperor himself, it just doesn't really give him that good defense. His durability is kind of weak versus just about any other faction leader of his class. I wouldn't really expect him to see him run competitively much, given how strong the competition is from the other Dark Angels HQs. They do have access to a whole load of very efficient ones. Overall, for the combined score, that would have the Lion equal to Guilliman, though picking up far more points for the look of his miniature compared with other categories. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Angry Angron, Demon Primarch of the World Eaters. Lore-wise, perhaps a fairly simple soul, a blood-mad Primarch fallen for Khorne, pretty much a demonic embodiment of Khornate rage, not a lot of room for much else in his repertoire besides martial perfection and sheer anger. I feel like his Heresy era backstory is interesting enough to be honest. Compared with the other traitor Primarchs, he's perhaps got a good reason to hate the Emperor, given that he chose not to help his gladiatorial uprising, and all of Angron's kinsmen up to then basically got killed. Seems to have been a pretty strange and perhaps cruel choice on the Emperor's part there. In current 40k and empowered by his butcher's nails, he takes hyper-violence to the next level, cutting through huge swathes of enemies every time he manifests, and then when the enemy does eventually manage to put him down, he's banished back into the warp, only to start a ticking clock where he just manifests again in 8 days, 8 hours and 8 weeks. Though maybe someone should have told him that that actually adds up to a bit more than 9 weeks. You probably don't want to mention that to him though, he'd just get angry. In general, maybe just a little bit limited for character development, maybe why he scored a bit low here. Model-wise, I do think he's fairly solid. He got ranked 3 out of 5 here due to stiff competition with Mortarion and the Lion. A pretty epic centerpiece for a World Eater's army in my opinion. I think they have executed him very nicely. Pretty much as you might have expected, a great big screaming angry demon of Khorne, looking thoroughly powerful, and his wings have just ridiculously enormous biceps. Certainly doesn't look like the sort of guy you want to have screaming at you and charging at you straight over the battlefield. Finally, in terms of in-game value, you guys voted him as best of any of the Primarchs, 360 points for a massive amount of melee, potentially 39 attacks against light infantry, or 13 attacks at damage D3 plus 3 if he needs to break apart some heavies. There's pretty much nothing in the game that can really ignore that. He's got the speed to get there as well with a great big 16-inch movement, and he's fairly tough to take down with toughness 8. On top of that though, he's got 2 really very nice abilities, particularly the power play of keeping units in melee with him, potentially killing one unit, consolidating into the next, and then preventing them from falling back. That could be absolutely disastrous against some shooting armies. And then perhaps true to his lore, Angron can re-manifest. If you've got enough blood tithe points, he can just burst back into reality with a fair bit of health remaining, potentially all ready to jump on another target out of deep strike, or even just soak a whole load more enemy fire. It's all pretty strong. To be honest, I probably would agree that he's perhaps the strongest of the Primarchs point for that ability. Though kind of interestingly, within World Eaters list themselves, he does have some very strong competition with Lord Invocatus. He's a very common choice to lead the army, giving some big pre-game moves to 8-bound units to get them into the midfield and then charging at the enemy in the opponent's first turn. Still though, Angron lists still do very well. He can be a big nightmare for certain armies to deal with, and I feel like compared with his brother Primarchs, he might be the one who's going to cause the opponent the most problems, provided the blood tithe can keep flowing. Overall, putting that together in our combined scoreboard for fun, Angron will be scoring 10 points there, a bit more carried by his game rule vote for that, and that'll put him equal to Mortarion. Looks like the Demon Primarchs of Nurgle and Khorne are winning the combined vote here. Finally, just for those interested, here are the breakdown of the individual votes. Guilliman was really quite significantly ahead in terms of the lore, hoovering up a fairly massive amount of the vote at 29%, and for the most part a lot of you finding Magnus and the Lion a bit more interesting than Angron and Mortarion. Miniature-wise, again pretty big disparities here. Mortarion really quite comfortable in his victory, then the Lion and Angron in their places. Guilliman and Magnus really are quite far behind on this one, and to be honest I probably would agree with that assessment myself. Finally, in terms of strength of gameplay for the points cost, here you guys rated Angron first, then Mortarion, then following up with Guilliman, the Lion and Magnus in that order. As I mentioned, if I'd been ranking these myself, I probably would have swapped Guilliman and Mortarion round on this list. I feel like perhaps people underestimate just how much value the rerolls of the Primarch of the Ultramarines can bring to the table. As mentioned before, Guilliman's included far more commonly in competitive Ultramarines lists compared with Mortarion in competitive Death Guard ones. Let me know your thoughts though. How do these votes and rankings stack up with how you guys would have rated the Primarchs in terms of lore, gameplay and model looks? Obviously there's nothing unanimous about these ones, all very much open to interpretation. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention as well that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page too, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.